Some people think that meaningful work has a great deal to do with autonomy, having a say over how you produce, perhaps even some say over what's produced in the end. Some have simply thought that meaningful work is a matter of subjective psychologies, whether we find it satisfying in a particular sort of way, whether we find it sort of purposeful. Others have thought that meaningfulness in work has to do with the meeting of the needs of others. But I'm afraid to say there's no consensus on this at all. What one worker says would make his or her work meaningful may be quite different from what another worker says would make their work meaningful.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. I would argue that whether we call it philosophy or not, every single one of us struggles with philosophical questions about work, whether we're thinking about it as leaders or whether we're thinking about it as people at work. It affects our autonomy, our dignity, our relationships, even our sense of self. Is it right to work so much? Is that the good life? If I'm a leader, what kind of work should I encourage? Why does our society reward certain kinds of work and not others? And what kind of work is actually worth doing? So I wanted to know, what do actual philosophers say about work? My guest today is Michael Cholbi, professor of philosophy at the University of Edinburgh and the author of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's definitive entry on the philosophy of work. He brings a rare lens to our conversation, one that connects ancient wisdom, contemporary ethics, and the day-to-day experience of workers at work today. In this episode, we go wide, from Plato to Marx to bullshit jobs and adaptive preferences, from dignity and autonomy to the bold idea that companies are morally responsible for the quality of the work that they create. We explore the deeper structure of work, how it shapes our lives, how it can harm us or uplift us, and how might it be redesigned to serve us better. All right, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, my conversation with Michael Cholbi. Michael Cholbi, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate the invitation.
So you wrote the entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on philosophical approaches to work and labor. And my experience of reading that entry has been absolutely enlightening. For people like me who work in the field of management and human resources and leadership, there are always these kind of brush fire arguments, what I would call, which is that you're trying to figure out how to solve something and people come to odds about very specific points about what is right and wrong or what's effective and what isn't effective. And what this entry lays out is essentially the playing field that we are playing on. It's all of the different arguments about work. And so I want to go through those in a pretty structured way. And what's interesting is a lot of times what I do when I read somebody's work is I boil it down into something, but this can't be boiled down because it's already boiled down. You cover the entire history of the philosophy of work. So first of all, why is work a worthy topic of philosophical discussion?
That's a really good question. I would say that the interest that philosophers have in work tends to wax and wane in response to wider realities in our culture. It's interesting to note that some of the really seminal texts that we think of as the cornerstones in the history of philosophy take up, questions about the significance of work. So, I like to point out to people that Plato's Republic can be read as a kind of treatise about work. It's a book that claims that people should be doing certain sorts of work and other people should be doing other sorts of work, and they should be motivated to work for this or that reason and so forth. But I think that philosophers' interest in work tends, as I said, to wax or wane. I think right now we're in a period where philosophical interest in work is increasing, and that's in response to wider cultural anxieties about whether work is doing the things that people want it to do. But I guess I would say that work is philosophically interesting for the same reason that any of the major institutions of human life are interesting. Why should we care about government? Why should we care about family? Why should we be concerned philosophically about friendship or personal relationships? Work is obviously an enormous aspect of the human experience, of the human condition. I think in order to understand and evaluate our lives, it would be a serious disservice, if we didn't think about the phenomenon of work.
And when you say work, it is not even philosophically necessarily settled what you mean. So, what are some of the distinctions in how philosophers frame work or think about work or define work?
There is some dispute there, you're right to note. I think some of the common points of agreement, though, would be things like these. I think the starting point for most philosophical conversations about the nature of work is that work is to some extent productive. Work is some sort of endeavor activity that creates something that could be of use to other people or perhaps to yourself. Oftentimes, of course, we're working to create goods that other people enjoy, whether you're working in a factory to produce a product or working on stage, entertaining people, or whatever you might be doing. You're working to create something, produce something that is of value to others. It could be merely of value to yourself. It could be that you're a self-sufficient farmer, right? And you're working to create produce that you yourself will consume. So it's productive activity, and productive activity that's done in some sense deliberately, guided by the aim of producing. An example I like to use is, there's a difference between the stand-up comedian, right, who's up there on stage trying to make you laugh, and me, because I have a kind of funny-looking walk, and I walk past people, and they get a laugh out of how ridiculous I am. I'm not working, right? The stand-up comedian is. I might be benefiting you through what I'm doing, but I'm not doing it, so to speak, deliberately. I think the other thing to say is that there's an aspect of working that is intentional, again, sort of guided by the aim of producing something of value to others. This doesn't mean, of course, that you can't, in the course of work, derive various sorts of benefits from the work for yourself, right? It doesn't mean that work has to be burdensome or unpleasant necessarily, but you have to, in some sense, be guided by this productive aim. So that means that work can be paid, but it needn't be. I think plenty of things that we do, in domestic life or as volunteers are clearly work, right? We're guided by this productive aim. And when we think about work, it's worthwhile to maybe contrast it with other sorts of things that I think definitely look rather different. So something like leisure, right? I think of leisure as the pursuit of some sort of good that by its very nature is designed to benefit only the person who's doing it. I cannot perform your leisure for you. You can't send me off to the movies and say, hey, go see this movie and enjoy it for me. That's not possible. So I think there's internal relationship in the case of leisure between what you're doing and you're being the beneficiary, whereas in the case of work, that relationship is a contingent or external one.
Okay. And it forced me to think on the definition that I've been using, and it's not far from that. But because of the framing of my work, it's slightly different, which is it's productive effort, and caveat, at least we think it's productive effort. It may turn out to be not productive effort, but we think it's productive effort. But because many of the listeners and I are interested in the experience of work, it doesn't have to be productive for somebody else. And it's defined very broadly, which is everything from a 10-year-old whittling a stick to the CEO of a company are workers and working because they all have an experience. And so it's a very experience-oriented definition, and the experience is there whether or not it's productive for somebody else or not. But what I admire about this is it's forcing me to ask the question about the definitions that we're settling on and why we're settling on them.
Well, I think I agree with most of the elements of the definition you laid out. In fact, I would note there's a whole lot of similarities between, I think, what I was proposing, what you were proposing. So certainly we want to, in any account of what work is, stick closely, right, to people's experience of work, which, as you say, is effortful, productive activity that's in some sense guided by that aim, right? You're not just sort of happening to produce something valuable for others. You're trying, in some sense, to produce something valuable for others. As you note, you may not succeed, right? Your work may not be, as a matter of fact, productive. So I think once we see work in that light, we can start asking other kinds of philosophically substantial questions about it. Why do we value it? What's its importance in human life? Can we actually attain, right, the various sorts of goods that we associate with work? And certainly there's a tradition within philosophy, I suppose it's most closely associated maybe with the tradition of Hegel and Marx, that thinks that the fact that we work, that we human beings work, is maybe the defining feature of us, that we are homo laborans, as the Latin would have it.
About what proportion of philosophical discussion about work is political philosophy, and what proportion is something else? And I'll tell you what I see the else is the lines of reasoning around what is the good life? How should we live? And that's not necessarily political philosophy. I don't know what that's called.
Ethics.
Okay, ethics. And so let's actually start with not the political philosophy part, but let's start with the ethics part. And you have a whole section on the value of work. And you start off by saying, what are the goods of work? Now, I noticed in reading this that philosophers use a different meaning of the word good. So a good in business is, I bought this computer, the computer's a goods. And then there's services, so make that distinction. But when a philosopher's talking about good, what does that even mean?
Well, I think you're highlighting that philosophers are often drawn perhaps to language that is abstract as befitting the purposes of what we're up to. We're trying to perhaps understand abstract concepts and principles. I think in this context, we might think of goods as more or less synonymous with something like benefits, right? Advantages, something like this. So when we ask about various spheres of human life, we can ask the same question that we're asking about work when we ask, what's the good of work? We can ask, what's the good of family life? What's the good of play? What is the purpose or point of these things that would lead us to think that they're worth pursuing, worth undertaking? Now, one initial complication in the whole discussion of the goods of work is that, by and large, for most people, work is a kind of necessity in the sense that their own economic viability requires them to engage in some sort of productive activity. So that, of course, has to be taken into account in thinking about the goods of work. That's one of the things that people are trying to attain through work, right? Is some measure of economic viability or prosperity for themselves. But of course, we might think that the story about the goods of work extends much further than that. People have thought that work is a particular sort of way of pursuing achievements, and achievements are good, or work is a particular way through which to develop or manifest our skill set, or work is a particular way to relate to other people in a distinctive way. So again, thinking of goods here as benefits, advantages, reasons to pursue would be a good construal of what we're talking about when we're debating these matters.
And so you laid out a series of goods that come from work. So there's the exchange value, which is what I get for working. And then beyond exchange value, there's social endeavor, rationality and self-development, meaningfulness, and as a precondition for other goods, dignity. So I want to go through some of those which are not self-evident.
None of them are.
Yes. If we're being rigorous, none of them are. Social endeavor as a good.
I think one of the things that people can look to work to do, and of course, I'm not suggesting that they always achieve this. In fact, I think this is one that can be somewhat difficult to achieve. One of the things I think that people can look to work for is it's a way of collaborating with others in a particular sort of way. So there's a difference between, say, being a parent and cooking a meal for your child and collaborating with someone else on the preparation of a meal that the two of you are going to enjoy. Many philosophers have thought that one of the goods of work arises when there's a special way in which workers are related to one another in the production of some good. One of the touchstones in the history of philosophy work is, of course, Marx's theory of alienation. And one of the things that Marx proposes is that modern work within capitalist societies in particular, he says, is prone to alienating workers from one another. And of course, what he's inviting us to think about most centrally is the mode of production that occurs on the factory assembly line. So you think about the work that occurs on the factory assembly line. Each worker does their own task. They do this task repeatedly over and over again. There's this chain of production, right, through which a good moves. But the workers don't collaborate or communicate all that much with one another. Sort of each is meant to do his or her part in the production chain. To the extent that they're working together only because someone has designed this production process so that they work together, but they themselves aren't designing it or shaping it or influencing it. So that's a case where, if you accept Marx's picture at least, it doesn't seem like the goods of work that are associated with work as a social endeavor are being realized. Each individual is a kind of atomic worker, contributing causally their own little part of the production, but not meaningfully engaged with the productive contributions of others. They're in some sense not working together.
And there's two understandings for me of the word alienation. So one word, alienation, means essentially separation from others or lack of belonging. You're just loose people working together. But the other term, that the way I've heard that referred to, is that it is an infringement of an inalienable right to the ownership of one's own product. And so that it's the detachment from whatever is produced, and that the ownership of that produced thing is an inalienable right of workers. And are those both right? Because I think you described the first one, but the second one is one that we had on the show, David Ellerman, who was talking very much about the inalienable right to ownership of one's product or control of one's product. So is the second one a real thing?
Well, I think within the Hegelian Marxian tradition that really uses alienation as an important tool for thinking about work, I think they would say these are different aspects of the same general class of phenomena, right? So the worker who is alienated from other workers is in some sense separated, as you say, but the worker who is not in a position to perceive or control the products of their labor or see themselves in the products of their labor is alienated in a different sense. I think the question of the control of the products of your labor is more of a sociopolitical question at heart. But I think that the idea that's kind of the complement idea, right, to alienation is rather Marx's notion of objectification, right? The idea that part of what we're trying to accomplish in work is to make it the case that our wills and our intellects create something in the world that reflects back to us, right, our own capacities. So the example I always like to use with my students to motivate this thought, is to ask them, well, when you were a kid, didn't your parents take that piece of art you made in kindergarten and put it up on the refrigerator, right, with your name on it? That's what Marx is talking about, I think, with objectification, this yearning that people have to alter the world in accordance with their own wills and intellects, and then see in the world a kind of reflection back at themselves of their own wills and intellects. And one of the things that, of course, Marx and other commentators have been interested in, concerned about, is the ways in which modern economies and maybe modern workplaces stand in the way of workers achieving that kind of objectification. I think the most recent kind of blossoming or rediscovery of this idea was, in David Graeber's essay and book on bullshit jobs, his observation that it seems like many workers can't really point to something that their efforts produce that they can say, this is me, this is what I contributed, this is the world reflecting back to me my own efforts and ingenuity. And I think that that's something that I would say is a genuine yearning that people have through work, right? Is to, if you will, make an impression on the world that bears the marks of them. And again, the factory assembly model, which was very much in Marx's mind, is almost designed not to do that. It's the point, right? Is that you as the worker don't have much influence on what's produced, how it's produced. It's in some sense designed to be a kind of work where objectification is precluded at the outset.
It's interesting. And this is very reflected in my own research and research of others that have looked at what people want from work. And one thing people routinely say is, I come to work with teams. They say it for different reasons, but one of the reasons is because I want to learn from other smart people. The other one is I want to amplify myself to get more done. Another reason for working with teams is just the opportunity to help others around them shine. There's a whole constellation of reasons why people want to work with others directly. And in terms of making a mark, we have talked about it a lot as that a lot of products have a detect, which tells you when you've completed an action. And so then the one thing I ask people is, they say, well, this is what I want from my work. And I say, can you tell when you've achieved it? And a lot of them say, I can. And a lot of them say, no, it goes off into the ether. And so our frame is that work is a product that we sell. And so the reason that companies sell, and we'll get to that later because it pushes work into the philosophy of commerce in a way that it may not have been before. I don't know. But as a product, we ask, what do you want from this product? And then we look to attach those attributes to the work itself. So social endeavor, rationality, and self-development. is the next on the list. What does that entail?
So there, I think the main philosophical progenitor is a figure like Aristotle. Aristotle was so impressed by craft, the idea that people can create things, solve problems in working. And the interest that I think we have in craft, right? The idea that in performing work, we're trying to solve problems, to address challenges and so forth. Most people want their work to be challenging, right? They don't want it to be mundane, repetitious, and so forth. And so part of what seems to be going on there, and this again connects, I suppose, back to objectification, is that when we work effectively and the things that we produce are valuable and so on, what we've done is we have engineered the world to fit some design or some aim of ours. And in so doing, we're sort of realizing, right, our own capacities. Most of us like the development and exercise of our capacities. It seems to be a central feature of human life that we don't want to let our capacities lie fallow or go undeveloped. We can't develop all of them, but work seems like a special sort of opportunity that modern societies give us to try to develop and exercise those capacities. I don't think we necessarily need to be all that we can be, as the Army used to ask us to be, but most of us want to be something more than just an undeveloped lump of potential.
The next on the list is meaningfulness. And it's such a big word. And the thing is that people use the word all the time. And I think we use it quite loosely. And I'm excited to hear what philosophers say, because philosophers care a lot about being specific with words. And so, what does that even mean?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you. Well, I would say that in recent philosophical discussions of work, this is one of the most contentious questions, right? What is it that makes work meaningful? I suppose one place to start there is to say, well, we might think that meaningful work is work that is a part of or that contributes to a meaningful life. One difficulty there is we don't even have a very good handle, I suppose, or certainly there's a lot of controversy around what makes for a meaningful life. I think when people talk about meaningful work, here are some of the things that people say. Some people think that meaningful work has a great deal to do with autonomy, having a say over how you produce what you produce, perhaps even some say over what's produced in the end. So that's one view that philosophers have held about meaningful work. Some have simply thought that meaningful work is a matter of subjective psychologies, whether we find it satisfying in a particular sort of way, whether we find it sort of purposeful, something like that. Others have thought that meaningfulness in work has to do with the meeting of the needs of others, that meaningfulness in work arises when our work efforts answer to the needs of others. But I'm afraid to say there's no consensus on this at all as to what makes for meaningful work, and it's been one of the most highly disputed areas. It is, I think, telling, right, that at least the literature that I'm familiar with says that most people, when you present this concept to them, kind of agree, right? They do want their work to be meaningful. But of course, it's a little hard to know what it is that those research subjects are saying, what they have in mind, right, when it comes to thinking about their work being meaningful. What one worker says would make his or her work meaningful may be quite different from what another worker says would make their work meaningful. So I'm not sure that it's the easiest starting point for thinking about the goods of work. In some ways, I think it's the hardest starting point for thinking about the goods of work.
Yeah, that aligns again with my research, which is that everyone agrees that they want meaningfulness and to make a difference. But when you ask them what they mean, like what's a worthy difference and what's meaning to you, you get a great deal of diversity. And so, put it this way, it's one of those things that is true, but knowing it is not useful until you get to the more detailed meanings of the word, like what's underneath there. I mean, as designers can't say meaningful. I'm going to design some meaningful work. Can't do it. You have to get to what specific people mean when they say that.
I think that's right. It's a good conversation starter around the goods of work. Certainly, in my experience, when I speak to people about what they find valuable about work, dropping that notion out there, hey, is your work meaningful, does provoke a lot of thought. Whether that thought leads to the same place in the end, I think it often does not. That doesn't mean it's not a useful concept for people to think about their own work, but maybe it's not a particularly powerful concept for designing workplaces or thinking about society at large, thinking about policies that foster or make available opportunities for meaningful work. it's not obvious what kinds of opportunities it is that we're targeting there.
And you have dignity as one of the goods. We might have to tease it out from meaningfulness. A part of it might be asking, what's the source? What are the philosophical sources of the examination of dignity as a part of work?
I think that the dignity of work definitely has its origins in Christian thought. So Pope John Paul II, in an encyclical produced around 1980, I believe it was, made famous this thought that work should be evaluated by reference to its dignity. Martin Luther King, a Christian activist, one of his well-known statements is that all work has dignity. This one, I have to say, I feel some of the same frustrations that I feel about meaning. Sometimes I think that there's a little bit of looseness or maybe carelessness with what it is that people mean to say here. I'm happy to say, for example, that all workers have dignity, that there's something dignified about the willingness to work or the effort that is put into work. Whether all work has dignity, I don't know. I think some work is sufficiently bad, not taken seriously by others, not valued properly, that in some sense, it seems to me to be true that that work doesn't enjoy dignity from a social perspective. It's marginalized and treated as unimportant. So I think, like meaning, it's not a bad concept to get a conversation started. I'm not sure how much it does to end any conversations about it, but it definitely has really powerful resonances, I think, in certain cultures. In the United States, for example, the idea that you should not want to receive welfare benefits, but should instead want to work, that idea is often allied with the idea that by working, you have dignity or you enjoy greater dignity or something like this. I'm skeptical about that. I think it's okay to be reliant upon others in certain ways. So I'm not sure that we should be so keen to endorse work in that way. But it's definitely a term that has had a lot of sway, I think, over political rhetoric, in particular around the value of work.
You have a whole section on the philosophical views of the non-value or negative aspects of work. And it's an interesting section. It's shot through with anti-work. And I don't mean anti-work like the Reddit thread. I don't mean that. But actual philosophical anti-work positions. And I don't think we're going to go through all of them. And by the way, we've already touched on some of them, which is one of the psychological bads. Do we say bads? If they're not goods, they're bads? Okay. So one of the psychological bads is alienation. There's a lot of unrecognized costs of work. It's actually one of the questions I ask a lot. I will ask you at the end of this, which is, what does your work cost you? But I think one of the really compelling ones is that we have essentially a warped psychology that capitalism and the work ethic has forced upon us that makes us feel that we have to think work is good, right? That it is majority good. And I want to start there by saying, you've written about work as potentially being an adaptive preference. What is that?
So the idea there is that some people, not every people, their relationship to work is one where they prefer work or they have a strong pro-attitude toward work. They look upon it positively, but they've come to have that attitude arguably perhaps under unjust conditions, conditions where they have to work and perhaps are not adequately compensated, and there's very bads associated with working. And they come to have a preference for work that's adaptive in the sense that because they can't avoid work as a matter of sort of economic reality, they fool themselves into thinking that it's better than it in fact is. And so the thought here is that we're quite good, we human beings, at self-deception or ignoring certain evidence in order to keep ourselves going, keep ourselves oriented toward things that we have to sustain or have to endure. And so the thought behind my hypothesis is that lots of people don't, in some sense, deeply or really prefer work. They just have managed to shape their psychologies to the reality that they have to work. And so they have shaped their psychologies in such a way that makes it sort of maximally tolerable day to day.
I want to bring up an idea that's really toward the end of the entry in the encyclopedia, which is, given these lists of goods and bads, one of the things you've looked into is, what would a future of work look like where automation, AI, various technologies make work not necessary? And I want to divorce that a little bit from whether or not that's actually going to happen. I have doubts that we're going to get to such a place of abundance that nobody works. But as a thought experiment, it's a really good one. So, what are some of the considerations of a future in which work is a lot less necessary?
Well, your reactions to that prospect will tend to reflect your existing philosophical commitments about the value of work. So there are some who would say that if automation and the development of technology makes it the case that human labor is far less necessary, that would be catastrophic. It would amount to a crisis in purpose, meaningfulness. It would deprive us, again, of some of those opportunities for social collaboration that we were talking about, deprive us of opportunities for development of our rational capacities. So there are some who would look upon that prospect with horror. It would be the beginning of the end, perhaps, in terms of the prospects for living good and choice-worthy human lives. I don't place myself in that category. I don't think that we will ever eliminate all of the demand for human work, but I think there's a lot to be said in favor of embracing technology to the extent that it reduces, to a large degree, the prominence or centrality of work in human affairs. When we talk about the various goods of work, identity and social collaboration and sense of purpose and so forth, there's very little evidence that I'm aware of that suggests that you need to work 40 or 60 or whatever number of hours per week in order to get those goods. Most of us could get those goods working far less. I suppose one bit of indirect evidence for that is that when people retire from the workforce, many people then proceed to do a few hours of volunteer work every week, which seems to give them these goods of work, but not at the scale that 9-to-5 work might give someone. I believe that we should not try to pursue what I would say is quixotic pursuit of trying to eliminate all demand for human labor. I don't think we could do it, and it probably wouldn't be a good thing if we could, but we should probably hope for a future where technological development will allow us to reduce the place of work in human life, and also to allow for a wider range of possibilities for people's relationship to work. I think one of the things that I myself find most disheartening about the way work has developed in modern societies is that pretty much outside of those who have independent sources of wealth, almost everyone has to work, and they probably have to work full time. And I guess one of the things that I find slightly disheartening about that is that that's not something that everyone is cut out for or that everyone wants to do to the same degree. There are some people whose conception of what's best in their life is very oriented toward production, right? And the creation of things that meet different needs. Other people's conception of the good life involves a lot of sunbathing or, looking at art, things that aren't really work in any meaningful sense. So one of the things I might hope for in a highly automated future is that there would be less work that we have to do, right? There'd probably still be some that we have to do, but less work that we must do. And as a consequence of that, we would be allowed to have a wider range of relationships to work, and the relationships that we could have would be more authentic. We would be choosing those relationships rather than them being forced upon us as a matter of economic or social necessity.
Yeah, I can see how there might be challenges introducing people to the goods of work. Because the truth is, many times you don't get to the goods of work except by crawling across a bed of coals, and then you get to the other side and you say, oh, no, actually, this is pretty good. And so it's related to the adaptive preference that you wrote about, which is that we may have the capacity to love work, but it's not something that you get in the first minute. On Work for Humans, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company designs, builds, and delivers to employees. Along the way, people started asking how they could put these ideas into practice. So I founded the work design firm 11fold to help your company create the kind of work that makes teams feel alive and engaged instead of dead and dull. So you can reduce turnover and build commitment. We're doing something revolutionary here. Learn more at 11fold.com. That's 11fold.com.
Right. I think in the end, I think everyone would agree with the sentiment that we want people to want work for the right reasons. We want people to derive whatever value work might provide them for the reasons that work makes available. And you're certainly right that probably some of the goods of work take working in order to see what they're all about. That said, I would still be skeptical that people need to work as much as they do, as long as they do across their lifetimes in order to realize those goods. And of course, many people don't realize those goods. I think one of the things that has made work a more prominent topic of interest amongst philosophers in recent decades is the sense that maybe over the past generation or so, we've entered into a period where work is in crisis, in the sense that people really look to work to provide a whole bunch of things, but increasingly it disappoints them. And I think there's a couple of responses to that. One is, as we've been discussing over the last couple of minutes, maybe to reduce the centrality of work in human life, but also perhaps to have a more chastened, slightly more realistic sense of what it is that work should provide us. The prominence of work in many societies has coincided with the decline of other kinds of things, the decline of what some people call the third sector, right, or third places, clubs and societies and private associations and churches and these other sorts of things. And I think it's worth considering whether we might benefit from reducing the prominence of work in human life in order to make these other elements of human life more available to us.
Yeah, and prominence can mean the amount of work, but prominence can also be the extent to which we let it define us, or the extent to which we judge those who don't work. It's a less prominent means a handful of things. And in fact, several of the bads that you listed out in the negative aspects of work get a lot worse at 60 hours. So for instance, the cost of time away from family is one of the bads. There was a list of things that were costs.
I tend also to think that when people talk about unemployment as a social problem, overemployment is also a kind of problem. That some people are working more, right, probably than is good for them.
Yes.
And one of the things that we might hope for in an automated future is maybe a more equitable and arguably more just distribution of work. Maybe many people would work far less. Maybe they'd work only half what they presently do, but perhaps that would afford the opportunity for others to work more than they presently do. So I think that's a possibility that's worth entertaining, worth taking seriously. But as you say, the centrality of work in human life in societies that are work-centered or that are allied with the work ethic, it's got a very powerful hold on us. I'm certainly not the first person to observe when strangers meet each other in affluent societies, the first thing that you learn about a person typically is, what is it that they produce? But you might sort of wonder, is that the most important thing that you want to know about someone? Should it be the thing that's most central to their identity as opposed to, I don't know, where they're from or what their family relations are, or I suppose a few centuries back, what church they attend or something like this? So I think part of my own outlook on these things, which is sometimes called a kind of post-work perspective, is it should be available to people for work to be a source of identity. But I think that it shouldn't be a mandated source of identity, that people should have available to them other sources of identity that are not so much wrapped in what they can produce.
Michael Lewis, the author, spoke about growing up in New Orleans. His father was a doctor. And he said, in New Orleans, when he was a kid, what you did was not the thing. It was not the identity. It was a much more relational environment. And it was about spending time with people without the overlay of what your work was.
Yeah. It's very hard, I think, for people to get away from that now. I took part in a focus group, around these issues once. And the task was for us adults in this room, there are about a dozen of us, to speak to one another for 10 minutes without talking about work. And of course, that's hard for people because then they have to shift to, what are my hobbies? What are the things I like to do in leisure? What do I think about current events? These other sorts of things. But I think it's perfectly okay for people to want a good bit of their identity to be wrapped up in their productive capacities. That's not a bad way for human beings to live, but I think it's not the only good way. And I think what work-centered societies do is they broadcast very powerfully the message that that is essential to your identity, and it is one of the only good ways to live a valuable human life.
By the way, this is a perfect example of how the encyclopedia entry, I can, at each of these discussion points, think of somebody who's been on the show who focused on that particular point. And so Simone Stolzoff came on the show, talked about his book, The Good Enough Job. And The Good Enough Job was all about, come on, everybody, let's step down from thinking that all goods are going to come from work and that all identity should come from work. But that's just one example. Every time we talk about one of these things, I can think of somebody who's arguing that point. And so I want to get on to the justice and politics of work. I'm going to focus on a couple of things that I think are the most mysterious. In regards to the justice and politics of work, you spoke about distributive justice, and it was very interesting to me that that could roll up into it how the benefits of work are distributed, but also how the harms of work are distributed. So I thought being able to look at both the distribution of goods and bads. I'm going to go through all of them and come to the one that I think I want to drill in the most. The next is equality in workplace governance. And so how those structures can be seen as either unequal or oppressive. There's a great section in there on Elizabeth Anderson, who we had on the show just this last few months, and democracy at work. And then there's gender care and emotional labor, we may get to, but the first one that I want to talk about is contributive and productive justice. And it had never occurred to me to think about whether or not work should be mandated. And it settles on the moral obligation to contribute to the productive economy through work. What is the philosophical history of that concept?
I think the notion of a duty to work, there's historically two strands, one of which I would say is less prominent now than the other. But certainly within, for example, the Christian tradition, the idea that work was a way of glorifying God, or it was a way of realizing a calling, right? Realizing your place within a society, right? That's a notion that had a lot of traction in a lot of Christian circles. Over time, I think it gave way both philosophically and to some extent theologically too, to the idea that we should think of society as a kind of vast network of cooperators, right? People who are cooperating in the production and distribution of different kinds of goods. And of course, in modern societies, that tends to involve a fair degree of specialization, right? I don't produce anything other than philosophical research and education, and other people consume it, and I buy groceries and other goods. So we're specialized producers, but we're kind of generalized consumers. And the thought is that if there is a cooperative scheme in place, right, if people are interacting with one another to produce and distribute these goods, that there's something unjust about expecting to enjoy the benefits of others' cooperation without contributing to them. So this is the notion that's usually captured under the idea of reciprocity or fair play. And this is an intuition that I think many people hold quite deeply, right? That if others are combining their efforts, directing their efforts in such a way that they're producing surpluses, right? That is to say, they're producing goods over and above what they could produce if they were just operating individually. They have a claim on that surplus, but people who aren't contributing to that endeavor don't. That argument, presented in that very schematic way, I think is a pretty strong argument. Of course, mapping that on to sort of real life conditions of work and so forth, I think invites a lot of complexity and difficulty. But that notion is a pretty powerful one. I do think one of the things that makes that argument perhaps a little bit shaky is that it's a good example of philosophers engaging in what we might think of like desert island thinking. A small society getting started on its own and people creating goods, and you don't want people to be able to freeload right off your productive activity and so forth. But in reality, in modern societies, people have long phases of life in which they're basically consumers but not producers, childhood, retirement, large numbers of people who are perpetually unemployed or underemployed for various reasons. So the thought that society will totter if large numbers of people are not contributing but are consuming probably isn't true. But again, this is a powerful intuition that people have, that cooperative endeavors, you don't get the benefits unless you put in the efforts. And I think there is something philosophically resilient about that insight.
Yeah, on two levels. One is, what's your mental model of the system and its fragility? The analogy that came to mind for me was, we should all take turns bailing the boat. If the boat's sinking, one person doesn't get to sit while everybody else bails, if they have the capacity to bail, because we all depend upon keeping the boat from sinking. If we feel that the system that we are in is quite fragile and that everybody needs to pull to make it work, then I certainly have the instinctive reaction that everybody should bail.
Well, and of course, we have concrete instances of this. You can look at military conscription as, I suppose, the clearest example of compelling people to engage in a reciprocal form of labor. But there are other sort of less dramatic examples in countries that have juries for trials. You'll be called to jury duty, which is in effect compelling you, right, to perform labor in the service of what's presumed to be an important social good. So again, I think that this is, an argument that I have a great deal of respect for. I think the challenges or where it gets interesting again is mapping it onto the realities of work, whether people's actual working conditions satisfy the relationships of reciprocity. It seems to me that one thing we might say is that there's a fair bit of work that people perform where they're exploited, which basically amounts to saying they're giving a good bit more than they're getting, in which case maybe they do have a duty to provide, but perhaps the society has failed in its duty to them, right? I mean, reciprocity is, after all, a two-way street, right? It's not just a demand that you work, it's also a demand that the society give back commensurate return. And for people working with very low wages or working in very dangerous occupations, that sort of thing, I think you could say that they're fulfilling their end of the bargain, but arguably the institutions they're working for or the society they're working in are not. And so again, the challenges here, I think, are in terms of mapping that kind of fair play or reciprocity insight, right, onto actual working conditions and actual societies, then a whole bunch of complexities arise.
Now, I want to ask some more specific questions about the way we've been framing work. As I mentioned earlier, our discussion on this show is about employees as customers and work as a product that companies build and design and sell. And a lot of those reasons are, A, because we think mathematically, I think mathematically that's true, that employees fit the role of customers. But it starts to frame work as something that I don't think it's exactly been framed as in the history of the philosophy of work, which is as a product. And the reason I think there's a distinction there, well, I don't know that there's a distinction, but all of a sudden it pushes work into a different realm of philosophy, which is the philosophy of commerce and what companies owe morally or ethically to the quality of that product. And so I guess my first question is, do you think it's different? Or do you think it's just the same?
Well, I mean, of course, when we're talking about work as exchange, where people are trading their work for wages, say, there's a sense in which one of the things that people are trading their labor for, I suppose we could think of the package of things that they're trading their labor for as a product in some broad sense of the word. One item within that basket of goods that they're trading for is, let's say, their wages, but there are other sorts of things that are in there too. And we've talked about some of these opportunities for collaboration and identity and status and esteem and development and exercise of one's skills and all those sorts of things. I think in that sense, the image of paid work at least being an exchange involving a kind of basket of goods is a very good image. You're being offered, I suppose, a basket filled with a kind of heterogeneous set of different things. I think one interesting question is whether we should expect work to give us many things in that basket. One of the characteristic features of work-centered societies or work-oriented societies is that they tend to encourage people, right, to think of work as potentially quite bountiful. It provides a whole bunch of things. And one of the issues, I suppose, that comes up in my own research is just the question of whether that's a sensible expectation, particularly when work is paid. Because in the end, so long as labor is distributed primarily through markets, it's going to be true that whether or not you get these goods depends upon whether or not your employer is willing to pay the market wage and so forth to allow you to access them. And there's no inherent connection between a labor market and your works being meaningful, or a labor market and your works being an opportunity for the development of your skills, say. Those are all contingent relationships at best.
Labor market, is that the market for laborers, or is that the market for work?
Well, of course, there's work that isn't in the labor market. There's unpaid work, there's care work, domestic work, right? All kinds of work that occurs without being marketized. Plenty of work that's performed that goes monetarily uncompensated. But most modern societies, most affluent societies rely quite heavily on labor markets to distribute labor and work. There's something to be said for this. I think there's some good defenses of this by philosophers and economists. But one of the things that I think would not make a convincing defense is to say that labor markets are good at doing anything other than making for the efficient distribution of work, particularly in relationship to wages, because that's the primary thing that employers have to offer workers and what tends to operate as the most central constraint on the prospects of whether you will be working for a particular institution or a firm. So invariably, questions, of the sort that we've been pursuing about the goods of work, you can't divorce that from the mechanisms of the allocation of work in most societies, which again, it tends to be market-based.
I think there was a big surprise during COVID that nobody had quite realized how their wages were set. And when people relocated because it became possible to work remote and their salaries dropped. And why was that? They said, I'm producing exactly the same value in the world. Why am I getting paid less? And the reason is that we set wages based upon regional markets for wages and labor. And so that philosophically, or at least structurally, nobody had really thought about before. It was a big surprise to a lot of people. And a few companies actually changed their policy. They said, no, we're going to pay you the same wherever you are.
Well, of course, one of the things that economists and philosophers have long asked about is, labor markets seem different from other kinds of markets. Labor markets, they're sort of less lubricated, right? People are not as mobile as tomatoes or, cell phones or whatever the goods might be. So there's features of labor markets that make them a bit different than other kinds of markets. They're less fluid in certain sorts of ways. But I think what you're pointing out is that the pandemic underscored or made possible, right, a kind of degree of fluidity in the sense that now you could hire somebody from anywhere. And so it was less important whether this particular employee lived in this city, this region, whatever it might be. I think that one of the things that's very challenging for us in terms of thinking about the justness of our working relationships, and in particular the justness of wages, is that most of us, when we think about our interactions with others and we think about them morally speaking, we tend to think of them as like two-place interactions. So if you, Dart, are a potential employer of mine and I'm an applicant for a job, and I'm thinking about whether or not the wage that you would be paying me is a fair one, I'm thinking about what am I contributing or what would I contribute, right? Were I to work for you, right? And so forth. But of course, in reality, except in the rarest of circumstances, if you're the one person who has some extremely valuable skill, you're, the Lionel Messi of your industry or the Michael Jordan of your industry or something like that. In reality, it's a triangular or multilateral thing going on because, of course, what's really going on is that there are other potential applicants for the job, right? And then sort of the moral equation changes because then, it's not so much a question of how valuable are my contributions, that may be part of it, but also how valuable are my contributions relative to someone else's contributions, right? And that's a different moral equation. And I think in general, it takes a lot of attention on our part to stay focused on that reality in terms of how it is that labor markets actually allocate the benefits that they distribute.
I'm curious about how people have discussed by the way, I never know the difference between morality and ethics. And so I always have a tendency to say morality and ethics. So I'm going to do that again. I'm interested in what philosophers have thought about the morality or ethics of the instrumentalization of people in general. So one of the things that we talk about on the show and in a lot of my work is that the history of work in the US for the last 100 years has been people as inputs to production, which is that most of our processes and everything is about input to production. You are as useful as what your utility to me is. On the other hand, the greatest crimes of history have been committed by people who were able to see other people as less than human. And so there's definitely a moral hazard there. And I'm wondering where the philosophical discussion around instrumentalization of labor has been.
I think that that's been a central concern of a lot of thinkers who have been troubled by the ways in which modern work has developed. So when you use that word instrumentalization, the figure that's going to come to almost every philosopher's mind is the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant is famous for, among other things, the idea that we're not to treat one another merely as means, right? We can treat one another as means, and we do so all the time. You might be a means to my enjoying a certain benefit. I might be a means to your enjoying a certain benefit. That's fine. But to treat one another merely as means or solely as means is, according to Kant, sort of the heart of what it is to treat someone unfairly or unjustly. It's captured in a principle that's sometimes known as the formula of humanity as an end in itself, right? We're to treat humanity always, he says, as an end in itself and never merely as a means. Now, Kant himself didn't say all that much about work. I mean, it shows up here and there in his writings, but he was the father, right, of a philosophical tradition going through Hegel, Marx, many other thinkers that pick up this essential idea that labor markets and maybe certain features of the way in which work is performed in capitalist societies tends toward, right, thinking of workers in instrumental terms, to think of them as just one more input into production. It's an input that you pay for not by exchanging for the input the way that the factory purchases screws, but you're purchasing workers or something like that, right? And the screws and the workers are essentially homogeneous. They're both inputs of production of different sorts. So, I mean, I think that that thought that we go deeply morally wrong, that something really deeply morally amiss when we think of one another just as tools of our respective ends or goals, is at the heart of a lot of skeptical philosophical work about work as an institution.
One of the things I see in companies is that if you took every single individual person and you asked them whether they adhere to that view, that people are more than inputs to production, almost everybody would say, of course they are. But when we systematize work in a corporation, the system that we build instrumentalizes people or objectifies people. Where has philosophy argued the point of whether or not systems have a moral agency or requirement? And I bring this up particularly in relation to Milton Friedman's essay in the New York Times that said that leaders of companies can't have a moral position. Their only moral position is profit. By the way, that argument has seemed to me just absolutely just fallacious. It's like this argument that systems can't have a moral requirement. So I'm wondering where philosophy has landed on that.
Well, many philosophers over the past generation or so have been deeply interested in what's come to be known as structural injustice. Roughly the idea that institutions, individuals, practices, etc., working in concert can produce outcomes that are unjust outcomes, unfair to certain sorts of people, even if in some sense the individual components of that system may not be acting in ways that are unjust. So the thought is not that the system is an agent or anything like that, but rather that we can produce outcomes through the design of certain systems where the outcomes are maybe not directly traceable to the local facts about particular employers or particular workplaces, say, but the overall design of it, right, could be unjust or unfair nevertheless. And so I think that idea has definitely been very attractive to many people, and there's certainly something to it, right? Those who are skeptical, again, for example, about relying upon the labor market to distribute labor, they might say, right, to the would-be employer, yeah, of course, within the context of a labor market, what should you do? Well, you should hire the people who are most qualified at the lowest wages you can manage to give them. That's what you're supposed to do within the confines of the system. But the problem there is that the system operates, right, in various sorts of ways to the detriment of particular individuals. And that's, I think, an upshot of an observation that many sociologists and philosophers have made, which is that when we think about the designs of systems, we have to differentiate that from the behavior of the actors within the systems. So you think about, for example, an example I think always makes the point well is, like legal ethics. There are things that maybe a defense lawyer should do insofar as they're a defense lawyer when they're operating within this adversarial system and so forth, that it would be unjust for them to do outside that system. But so if we think that the system is a good system, then we think it's defensible for them to do that. But if you don't have a just system, then it becomes harder to justify the behavior of the individuals and institutions within it, right? Because then it seems like they are contributing, if only in concert with others, right, to unjust states of affairs.
So I used to be a criminal defense investigator. Part of the reason I got out of the business, actually, was not because I thought the whole system was unjust, but rather because I could not abstract my behavior to the performance of the larger system. So in other words, yes, I was supporting the Constitution and I was supporting this bigger idea, but my behavior within that system
raises hard issues about integrity.
Yeah, exactly. And so I have a few closing questions I usually ask. We haven't left very much time for them. But one of them, the way I normally frame it, is I say, what job do you hire your work to do for you? It's sort of the same thing as saying, what is the good you get from work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because my own research on these topics is, as I was mentioning a few minutes back, kind of work skeptical or post-work. That is to say, I think we should try to treat work as sort of less central to human life. I think that'd be good for us. People, when they hear that, often assume that this means that I don't like my own work or that I'm disenchanted with my own work. And in some ways, the opposite is true, right? I think I've come to see that work as an academic has a lot of features that other people's work doesn't have, right? In some ways, I wish that other people's work were more like mine, or I wish that for them. I have a very high degree of autonomy. I don't report to anyone in an immediate sense. I don't have supervisees, not sort of underlings that are my employees and so forth. So I kind of have a great deal of freedom. I think in terms of the goods of my own work, I think my own work as an academic philosopher, it's been a chance to seed new ideas. Philosophy is a conversation that goes back centuries, millennia. And I guess I feel a certain kind of honor or privilege, right, to be able to even steer that conversation in even a modest way, right, in directions that I think are fruitful. And I like being an educator. I think one of the things that I've figured out over time is that regular contact with the youth is a good thing. Seeing people as they're trying to enter into the adult world and encountering them and trying to appreciate their frame of mind, I think it helps you maintain a perspective of a little bit of distance from your own adult situation, to remind yourself that there are people who have not yet entered into the world of adulthood fully or are making plans for it. And I find that to be, the opportunity to educate, to be in that way rejuvenating.
What does your work cost you?
There's an enormous amount of rejection in academic research. Grant applications, journal article submissions, all those sorts of things. In most cases, the chances that you'll be rejected are far higher than the chance that you'll be accepted. So one of the things that I suppose you need to develop is something of a thick skin, but I guess one of the costs is a sense of easy satisfaction. There's very little easy satisfaction as an academic researcher, I would say. The other thing to say, is that it's an economic sector where there's quite high barriers to entry. So you really have to be fully in. It's difficult to sort of be kind of half-hearted PhD student or a half-hearted early career academic, right? You really have to commit fully, I think, to have any sort of expectation of success. And there's big opportunity costs in the sense that if it doesn't work out, it happened to work out for me, but there's plenty of people for whom it doesn't work out. There are very big opportunity costs in terms of time and restarting your career in your 30s or something like that. Fortunately, I didn't have to do that, but I absolutely see that that's a big cost that people have to bear.
And I'll bet it's 98% of people who go through a PhD program, for instance, do not end up in the role that they were targeting.
There's pros and cons there. It's a big global market. I find my own situation quite remarkable. I didn't grow up in Scotland or anything like that, but here I am working in a really interesting city at a really interesting institution. So there's all kinds of possibilities there, but definitely one of the things that I suppose is a cost is that you're not going to be in a position to dictate things like where you live. If that's one of the things that you want out of your career, the academic path is absolutely the worst path you can go down.
Right. And on the question of easy satisfaction, there is a trade-off between easiness and satisfaction, which is harder things are more satisfying when you're successful. So
It's true. But as I said, there's a lot of rejection. The prestigious journals in my discipline, for example, reject 95% of the manuscripts they receive. So when you are accepted there, you feel a little bit like touched by the hand of God or something like that. So
yes, I recently published in a journal that's very hard to publish in, and good Lord, it feels good, but it's hard. It's super hard. I saw you published in a journal, Autonomy. There's a journal. That's if I was going to start a journal, call it Autonomy. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
It's been a fun conversation.
It's super interesting, and it's a different way of approaching it. Instead of by arguing points in space, looking at the whole thing. And so, where can people learn more about you and your work?
The article that we've been talking about in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is certainly a good place to start if you're interested in that in particular. So the encyclopedia's website is plato.stanford.edu, and if you just search work and labor, it should come up first.
And let me say one point on that. We scratched the surface. I mean, the truth is, we skipped across the major topics, but each one of those major topics has a really deep dive in it, and it's worth going in and looking at the full article.
Beyond that, I do have a YouTube playlist, which people can look up if they're interested sort of in past talks and podcasts. And then my own personal site is michael.cholbi.com. So lots of places to go.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.